So now we'll begin our lesson on the pelvis. And Elvis here is going to show us a little bit about how to move our pelvic bones. I find that when I work with people in their bodies, they visualize the pelvis as a solid basin. And in fact, it's a bunch of joints that articulate and create movement. So as we look down the spine, we come to the sacrum, the very bottom of the spine, and this is actually part of the pelvis. So I find it very interesting that the spinal column also makes up the pelvis. On one side, we have one pelvic half, and on another side, we have the second pelvic half. They join together at two joints at the sacrum. We sometimes refer to this as the SI joint. This is a huge place for pain and discomfort in the body. Oftentimes, people have their spinal nerves move through this joint right here and get jammed, especially if the hip is rotating outward too much, if the gluteal muscle is gripping too much. So what we'd like to do is create more mobility in the pelvic halves in their relationship to the sacrum. And that's what we're going to see today in class. So we'll talk about 4 different bones of the pelvis. One, the tailbone, which is really the spine. The second, sitting bone 1 and sitting bone 2. That makes up 3 bones. And then as we turn him forward, the 2 pelvic halves also meet together at the pubic bone. And we can move these bones together in forward-facing poses, or we can move them separately in lateral or wide-angled poses. And that'll be really essential to the opening and mobility of your hips. When the hips are tight, we also don't realize that it affects the knee dramatically. So tight hips are actually one of the reasons why we have a lot of knee problems. It's also true that flat feet create knee problems, but for today we're going to concentrate on how opening the hips can really soften and create stability in our knee joints. So we're going to have Jay help us with this. So Jay, can you come onto the mat on all fours? Mm-hmm. Take your knees just a little further back. And then come into a cat position, rounded spine. This is cat pose. The tailbone descends here. Now let the belly drop and lift the head. Cow pose, the belly relaxes and the tailbone lifts. But now we're going to create even more movement here. So I'd like you to take your front bone, your pubic bone, a little further back. And you'll get a little bit more opening and mobility in the pelvis. So the sitting bones will actually widen. Keep the sitting bones wide and lengthen your tailbone down and draw your belly up for cat pose again. When he does that action, the sitting bones close back behind him. So that's one very solid, full movement. Now he wants the opposite movement in cow pose, so he can initiate the movement from the front, from the pubic bone, and feel a widening and opening in his hips. This is a very difficult pose for a gentleman to do because we tend culturally to be tighter in the hips as men than we are as women. One more time, lengthen the tailbone. And then broaden the sitting bones and take the pubic bone back. Wonderful hip opener for everyone, but particularly for gentlemen. Now he's going to press from his hands, curl his toes under, and come into downward dog, regular downward dog. Again, in gentlemen, we tend to see a rounded spine, and for women with very tight hamstrings. So he doesn't have a lot of movement here in his hips and pelvis. Let's come back down to the knees. To help this along, he's going to create cow pose. So he's going to keep the knees bent and move back into downward dog from his front bone, from his pubic bone, and we'll see that we can have his spine elongate more and his hips open more. He'll press from his hands up into his tail to create even more stretch. Keeping the sitting bones lifted like this, begin to straighten the legs. Much different than the first version. Come down to your knees and let's show them the first version again. Come into downward dog. And we see a rounding in the lower back and the sitting bones drawn together. Now come down. Cow pose, we can see the sitting bones widen and a little arch in the lumbar spine. That's what we want to keep as we move into downward dog. From the front bone, from the pubic bone, reaching back, elongating the spine. And again, we have a beautiful curve in the spine and a wonderful opening in the hip bones. Lower down to your knees. And let's come up to stand. Facing me, take your legs wide. Warrior two. Now take your left elbow on your thigh and your other hand to your hip. So we saw in cow pose how we can work the pelvic halves together. Now we're going to witness the pelvic halves moving separately to get more of a hip opener in these lateral facing poses. So as he brings his hips back, like he would in cow position, they come back together, exaggerate, they come back together, and the back leg stays really still. This is his stability leg. The more stable this is, the more opening we can get in the hip for mobilizing the front hip socket. So begin to draw your left sitting bone under. Good. And then turn the chest. Again, take your sitting bones back and wide. Cow pose, really exaggerate, good, yeah. Keeping that action in the back leg, start to rotate the front sitting bone under, and you can see the movement here. That's what makes this pose a hip opener. Now turn your belly, turn your ribs, turn your shoulder, and he's working hard to get this hip open. Good, come up to stand, and then step to the front of your mat. Tadasana. Tadasana is a very difficult pose, and some yogis say that if you do the pose correctly, you can achieve enlightenment. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is how our heels actually mirror our sitting bones. So as he draws his heels together and his toes apart, which is how we tend to stand when we're waiting for the bus, or we're standing in line at the grocery store, or we're picking our children up from school. And so there's a lot of tension and squeezing in the gluteal muscles. Remember that the nerve endings come down here, so there's lots of possibility for squeezing the nerves at the buttocks level, sciatica. So as he takes his heels apart, there's a softening in the gluteal muscles, and he can take his big toes in, and you're in standing pose, Tadasana. Now his back is free, the sacrum can hang, and the nerves are released. So now we're going to see the rotations of the pelvis. So Jay's going to take a block and put it between his legs to give him some information to the inner thighs, so that the inner thighs have something to grip against as they rotate inwardly and outwardly. So he'll take the block pretty high to the inner thighs, and then he can bring his hands to his hips, and as he folds forward, he's going to use the inner thighs to pull the block back behind him. And he can reach down and touch his knees. And he has a lovely alignment already from the hip bone to the ankle. Now as he comes up, he's going to try to keep the legs in that position and just lift his upper body, coming back into Tadasana. Once his head lifts, he's going to drop the tailbone and engage the navel, keeping the legs underneath him for support. The very opposite of this is where he would have his hips coming forward and his shoulders back. Again, this is an alignment that we see when people are waiting for the bus or doing something unconscious. They sit hanging into the lower back and pushing the pelvis forward. So let's watch again as Jay bows forward, taking the inner thighs back, bringing the hips in line, so the hip bone in line with the ankle bone. And then holding that, he's going to come upright, lengthening the tailbone down as he rises, as if it could hit the top of the block, and lifting the belly up. What he doesn't do is push the legs forward. And now he's in a perfect Tadasana, legs supporting the hips, hips supporting the shoulders, and the head resting right on top. And now we'll do Warrior One. So Jay, step your left foot back. Bring your hands to your hips. As he brings his hands to his hips, he's going to square his hips forward, so the left hip bone is going to come forward. As the right sitting bone reaches back, we can see the beautiful hip opening here that can occur when we're doing a fully balanced Warrior One. Holding that, he'll release the tailbone down and lift the tummy up to create the elongation in the spine. Holding that, he'll descend the top thigh. So as that drops, he's really moving from his hip joint, not from his knee. Can you do that again, straightening your leg? Lunge into your knee. This is how I see most people work in class, and then they have knee injuries. Straighten again. This is really a hip opener. So he's going to initiate from the hip joint, descend the thigh, I almost never say bend the knee. I always talk about descending the thigh, working the thigh bone more parallel to the floor, and then the knee will follow. Bring your hands to a prayer position. The front leg is stretching away from the stability of the back leg. And to finish off the pose, you can take the arms out to the sides, reaching up, and look up at the fingertips. He's beginning to work on a back bend here.